Okay, our last lesson was about the demand curve, and if we're going to do a lesson about the demand curve, it seems only fair to do a lesson about the supply curve. So we're going to spend a few minutes talking about that, and the good news is a lot of the ideas are going to overlap here, so hopefully this won't be too much additional information. Okay, let's start talking about the supply curve itself. First of all, when we say the word quantity supplied, what do we mean? Well, when we said quantity demand, what we were talking about was the amount, the quantity, that somebody wanted and was willing to buy. Well, a quantity supplied is the amount of a good that a seller is willing and able to sell. Very straightforward, nothing too complicated. How much does the producer or the seller or the supplier of a good want to and is willing and is able to sell? Now, just like we had a law of demand, we have a law of supply. If you think back for a minute, the law of demand said that as prices decrease, the quantity that people were willing to buy would increase. And that made sense, right? Cheaper prices mean people are willing to buy more. The law of supply says something a little different. It says that, again, other things equal, the quantity supplied of a good rises when the price of a good rises. And if you think about it, let's suppose you're talking about somebody selling hot dogs. If somebody's selling hot dogs and they were selling those hot dogs for $1, maybe they wanted to sell 10 of them. But if they could sell them for $2, they'd probably be willing and able to sell a lot more hot dogs. That's what the law of supply states. Really what it's saying is that price and the quantity supplied have a positive relationship. They go the same way. And just like with the demand, we can put it into what we call a schedule, or just a chart that shows that relationship. So let's take a look. Suppose we have our friend Alan here, who happens to be, again, selling ice cream. And Alan has a supply schedule. Notice that Alan, as the prices rise on the left, the quantity that he's willing to supply increases. They're going the same direction. And again, that makes sense according to the law of supply. But as always, I think the best way to show it is in the form of a graph. So we'll take a moment here and do that. At $0, Alan isn't willing to sell any goods. So really the first one is 0 and 0. We won't even mark it on the line. In fact, the second, if we go up to 50 cents, for whatever reason, Alan's still not willing to sell any ice cream cones at 50 cents. Maybe the ice cream cones cost him more than 50 cents, so there's no reason for him to sell it at 50 cents. We don't know why, but according to our table, he's not willing to sell any at 50 cents. So the first one we can really put on our graph will be at $1. At $1, Alan is willing to sell one ice cream cone. And then at $1.50, he sells two. At $2, he sells three. At $2.50, he sells four. And at $3, he's willing to sell 5. And of course, what we'll do is we'll connect the dots. That line right there is what's called our supply curve. Now, again, realize that just like our demand curve, exactly opposite of our demand curve, the supply curve slopes upwards, meaning that what's on the y-axis, the price of the good, and the x-axis, the quantity of good, have a positive relationship. They go the same way. So what you'll notice is as we rise from $2 to $2.50 in price, the quantity increases from $3 to $4. The quantity supplied, I should say, increases from $3 to $4. Okay. Just like with demand, there's a difference between what we call a change in quantity supply and what we're going to call a change in supply. Let's go through them again. Okay, what does a change in quantity supply mean? It means, first of all, that it's a movement on the supply curve. We're not actually moving the whole curve. We're just going from one place on the curve to another place on the curve. And that's caused by a change in price. Just as a change in quantity demand was caused by a change in price, a change in quantity supply is also caused by price. And again, I think the easiest way to see this would be with a graph. So let's take a look. Again, a reminder, how do we label these graphs? We have a P that always will represent price, a Q that always will represent the quantity, and S will be our letter that denotes the supply curve. You don't have to write supply out every single time. The S is good enough. Okay, so in this case, we're going to have at $1, we have a quantity supplied of 1. If the price of ice cream cones rise, for whatever reason, whatever the reason is that it rose, what's going to happen? All right, the price rises to $3. What we know from the law of supply is that the quantity is also going to rise, in this case to 5. Again, notice we've just moved along the supply curve. We haven't actually moved the supply curve. That's a change in quantity supplied. There you go. And we have a new point. Okay. Again, not to be confused with a shift of the supply curve. What does a shift of the supply curve look like? Well, remember, it's the way we say it is a change in supply. And what that means is the supply curve is actually itself moving to the left or to the right, or decreasing or increasing. And that's caused by something other than a change in price. And we'll get to that in just a minute or two. But again, let's take a look at what this actually is going to look like. So here we go again. Here's our graph, price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. And what do we notice? Here's our supply curve. Our very first one, we're going to label S1. What do we notice happens? The supply curve, when it's increasing, will shift to the right, and we'll label the new curve S2. Now, one thing we want to be careful about, sometimes people like to use a phrase. They'll say increase in supply or a shift to the right of supply. Either one of those is fine. So you might want to note that either of those phrases is okay to use. However, what I strongly discourage students from doing is using the words up and down. Supply went up, supply went down. Here's an example of why we don't like to do that. This curve is actually increasing. It's shifting to the right. And hopefully you'll see why in a second. But if you look at it, you could almost sort of see that it looks like it might be going in a downward direction. That's the reason we don't use the words up and down. We'll always describe this as an increase in supply or a shift to the right of supply. And again, what does that mean? That means that at the same price, the suppliers are willing to supply more. Obviously, a decrease in supply would be a shift to the left. And we'll label in this case this one S3 because it's the third curve we're drawing. Now, again, let me just make sure we're clear about this. What's actually happening here is that the supplier, for whatever reason, is willing to supply more, in the case of S2, or willing to supply less, S3, at the same price. Nothing here is being affected by price. This is all about how the supplier, I used this term in the first lesson, feels about supplying the good. In this case, they feel, for some reason, that at the same price, they can supply more on S2 or supply less for S3. Now, very quickly, what are the reasons why someone might have a change in supply? We're going to go through these pretty quickly because just like with change in demand, this is really a microeconomics topic. And if you take microeconomics, then you're very welcome to do this. But for the most part, we're going to just kind of breeze through these. The price of input, or sometimes we'll say the price of resources. If what it costs to make the good changes, then you can supply more or less based on that. That kind of makes sense. Technology. If technology makes it significantly easier to produce something, then you might produce more. Expectations, if you have feelings about what's going to happen in the future. For example, if you feel like there's a product that's going to come out in the market that's going to replace your product, you might be willing to sell your product for a lot less right now just to get rid of them. And also the number of sellers. How many people are actually producing the good would affect how many are being supplied at a certain price.